So we get to finally talk about another iPad this time around, and this is none other than the iPad Air 3, the iPad that came out in 2019. And to be honest, I was super happy when this specific device came out. It did bring a lot of newer kind of things to the table, but it also kind of recycled the iPad Pro 10.5 inch, kind of body, which I was a huge fan of as well. Now, this came out a little bit of time right after we got the iPad Pro 3rd generation, which was easily one of my favorite iPad designs ever. So this is definitely not a dated design, but when you look at something like the iPad Pros and the new iPad Air and the new iPad mini, we are kind of in this weird situation where this is a little bit of a dated design. Now, if you want to pick up this iPad or some other iPads, I would recommend this here. Links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside, this display was a 10.5 inch Retina IPS panel, and the resolution is actually pretty high, 1668 by 2224, very weird numbers, but it's a very high resolution display, and it was a very, very good display as well. It had True Tone on it, no 120Hz ProMotion like the iPad Pro 10.5 inch had, so that was kind of weird, but honestly, it was a very good panel, and I was a humongous fan of it for sure. Now, you do have some bezel around it, but it's totally okay, it's expected. You have Touch ID sensor with that home button on the front. On the bottom, you have that lightning port. You had a headphone jack on this, device as well, which was really cool. And on the back, you had that aluminum frame as well. A single camera setup light there too. And I will definitely tell you, this was a very solid, feeling iPad. As I've mentioned before in pretty much all iPad videos that I've done, Apple has never made an iPad that felt cheap. So they've never really made like a cheap or like unpremium feeling iPad. They have done a great job with pretty much every single iPad they've ever released. So me personally, after I see something like this, I am always a huge fan of how well Apple has done with these iPads. So if you're feeling it in the hand and if you're going to the store or you see it for sale somewhere and you're picking it up, you are still going to feel like you have a very premium iPad for sure. So in terms of that, humongous thumbs up without a doubt. Now in terms of the camera setup, this was also something kind of interesting. On the back, it had an 8 megapixel standard camera, and on the front, it had a 7 megapixel standard camera. Now, me personally, when I use this, camera for a little bit, I will tell you it's up there with like something like an iPhone 6 camera with like an iPhone 7 front-facing camera. Like, it's kind of hard to kind of describe, but I'll tell you, if you need a camera to kind of, take some photos here and there, I guess it's okay. But like I mentioned, I think a majority of people are using iPad cameras mostly for video calling, Zoom calling, and if you're in a pinch and you need to make like a, video on your iPad or something really quickly, then you could probably use something like this too. But I do think a majority of people out there are probably using these devices for pretty much just Zoom calls and FaceTime calls and different things like that. So for those type of activities, this iPad is perfectly fine. You are really not going to be experiencing too many issues with this specific iPad for those specific tasks. So if you're somebody in that realm, again, this is going to be a perfectly fine iPad for you. Now, on the other hand, if you're somebody who wants to go ahead and use this iPad as your main photography or video device, this is probably not going to be the device you want to go and pick up for those, to be honest. You're not going to be getting that great of experience, but I do think for standard tasks, like I mentioned before, you're probably going to have a good, feeling with it. You're probably going to have a good camera with it for sure. It wouldn't be my first choice, but I think it's pretty much okay. And, I think that pretty much covers it up in the camera standpoint. No 4K, no 1080p at 60 as far as I know either on any of the lenses. So some other big things to keep in mind, but in terms of the camera, that pretty much covers it up there. Now, in terms of the longevity of this iPad, this is a very interesting iPad because it came in the body as an older iPad Pro, but it had the internals of pretty much the latest and greatest at that time. So it had that Apple A12 Bionic chip, which was the best chipset at that time that Apple was making in 2019 in March or whatever. However, it did have 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, because of this, I do think it sits in line with the iPhone XR in terms of performance. So here's the thing, this device, as far as I can tell, is going to last as long as the iPhone XR, XS, and XS Max. So when you keep that in perspective, the XR came out in 2018, the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus and 6S are still supported. So looking like iOS 16, 17, this thing may end off with like iOS 18 or something, or maybe even iOS 19, who knows. So it's going to have a couple of more versions of software to come out without a doubt. So if you're planning on getting this iPad, don't be worried about software updates or how long this iPad's going to last. It's still going to be supported for quite a bit of time, so I wouldn't even really worry about that too much. If I were you, I would probably just recommend buying this iPad because because it has a couple of more years left in it, and you can even buy this iPad this year, and resell it next year or the year after, and you can even buy a newer iPad Air once those go down to the used market a little bit. So really the choice is yours, but honestly, if I had to say it, this iPad is not going anywhere anytime soon, and that pretty much covers it up in the longevity standpoint. Now in terms of the performance, like I mentioned before, it has that Apple A12 Bionic chip inside of it, and it has 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now with an iPad like this, you are still getting a very, very good and smooth performing iPad. Now is it the smoothest iPad of all time? Obviously not. It's definitely not, beating anything like the iPad Pros or anything, but it is still a very fast performing iPad, and I've mentioned this again, this is a very, very smooth device. Apple does a really good job with their iPads, and I've always found iPadOS to be a little bit smoother than iOS. I think iPadOS 15 was the rare exception where that really wasn't the case, but I will tell you, if you need to go and pick up an iPad, this is a very good performing iPad for sure. Now for standard basic things like taking notes and using an Apple Pencil to write on the screen and different things like that, this is a very good performing iPad. You can pick up the iPad Air 2 and still have a pretty decent performing iPad for those things. But if you're taking it up a notch and you're trying to get something that's, trying to get you from point A to point Z, and you're trying to just get an iPad that has the most amount of capability for the performance, this may not be the iPad for you. You may want to look at the iPad Pro 3rd or 4th generation. Those are going to be a little bit of a tiny bit better performing iPads just because they have more RAM, but this one is still pretty good. This one still has the A12 chip inside of it, and that is not an old or super slow performing chipset. So like I mentioned, if you're trying to get an iPad that has, a really good amount of performance for the price tag, this is a decent option. Is it the best? I don't know if it's the best one for the price, but I do think if you have to go and buy a used iPad or whatever, this is a really good device. I really don't think it gets crazy much more better than this, and if I were you, I would probably recommend looking into it. Now on top of that, I will say if you're trying to get something that has a little bit more of a newer design, the iPad Pro 3rd generation is probably the one for you. But for basic things like I mentioned, or even higher intensive things, this is a very good performing iPad, and I'm still a humongous fan of this iPad for sure. So in terms of that covers it up there. Now ending it off with the battery life, this specific iPad had a pretty big 8134 mAh battery inside of it, and that is honestly a pretty good sized battery to have on this type of iPad. I mean, it's not like the biggest battery of all time, but for its age, for its performance, for its price, it's pretty good, and I do think again it's a highlight more than it's a con. And because this thing has, it doesn't have ProMotion on the display and nothing like that, well, you're saving a little bit of battery like that in that area as well. So in my opinion, I still think it's a pretty good advantage for picking up this iPad in that standpoint. Like I mentioned, it's not the best iPad in terms of battery life, but it's a pretty good battery life device. So in terms of that covers it up there as well. And to be completely honest, I do think the iPad Air 3 is still completely worth it in 2022. I think this is a very, very good iPad for sure. Is it perfect? I don't think it's perfect, but it still gets the job done. And I do think for a lot of people out there, you would be very, very happy with this type of performance on this type of iPad. I think for standard things you're going to do across the board, it's going to be perfect. I think for heavier intensive things as well, it's going to be perfectly fine as well. It's kind of sits in the middle where the design is kind of dated and it's kind of not dated. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But if I were you, and if I had to go and buy an iPad, if I was trying to find the best value per dollar, maybe this is one of them. I would also look into something like the iPad Mini 5 if you want to save a little bit more money, and if you don't care about the size too much. Or you can also buy the iPad Pro 3rd generation. It's a little bit more expensive than this one in the used market, but it's also a really, really good value for sure. So in terms of that pretty much covers up this iPad in 2022. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section as well. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.